Hi, and welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington, and I'm so glad that you joined us here today. Just a reminder to please like and share and rate this podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Rating the podcast helps us become more visible to other people and helps us to show up on their feed. Help us get the word out of this podcast so that it can help and impact other women and other people going through grief who might feel alone and abandoned. This week we talk with Yolanda Smith, and we talk about grief as we are processing our trauma. A lot of us have had trauma in our childhood or even some trauma recently after we have lost someone or we've gone through a traumatic event. Yolanda talks to us about how she saw God with her as she reflected back on her past, but also saw God with her as she was processing her trauma. So join me in welcoming Yolanda Smith. Hi, and welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington, and today I have with me Yolanda Smith. Hi, Yolanda. Welcome.
Hi, so glad to be here.
Thank you. Yes, Yolanda and we did an interview a few weeks ago for our Thanksgiving podcast. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that, go ahead and go back and listen or watch that. It should be on YouTube and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Today, we're going to be talking about grieving trauma. So far in this podcast, we've really been focusing on grieving miscarriage in particular, but grieving losses of a life when someone passes away or we lose a child. And the definition that I have found of grief is it is a normal response to a major loss. And that loss can be death of a loved one. It could be the loss of health. It could be feelings of great sadness, anger, guilt, and despair that come along with this loss that we have, whether it is, like I said, the loss of a loved one, loss of a perceived like wealth, health, all these things can encompass loss and then cause us grief. And so we're going to really kind of dive in today about what is trauma and how are we grieving trauma. So, Yolanda, you said you had a definition, I think, for us of what trauma is.
The best definition I've heard for trauma comes from the psychologist Gabor Mate, and he says trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So, in other words, we all have traumatic events that happen in our lives, but they don't turn into trauma unless we don't have an empathetic witness to guide us through the processing of what happened. And another wonderful definition that I recently read by Dr. Jacob Hamm is talking about the opposite of trauma. And the opposite of trauma is presence, he says. So those two things go really well together in thinking about what trauma is and what it looks like in our lives.
So as an example, in childhood, we can experience something, childhood, or I'll use this example, for instance, as a birth doula, I dealt with women who experienced birth trauma. And so we would process through their previous birth trauma as they were pregnant with their second, third, fourth child before they went into the process of giving birth again, so that the fear and the pain and the anxiety revolving around that experience kind of didn't come back, or they were better able to handle it. And so like a birth trauma would be events that happened that weren't planned, that they didn't get to talk about with their provider or their loved one, or decisions that were made quickly that they weren't able to get their heads around before the event happened. Or certain traumatic events like the baby needing assistance when that wasn't something that they were expecting. So is that kind of, in that definition, is that kind of what you are talking about?
Yes, that's actually a really great example because oftentimes in those birthing experiences, there isn't time to process and there's no one to talk with afterwards because you're suddenly in the throes of a medical emergency or a child who needs extra care, or there's a mother-child separation that occurs. And yes, that trauma can be carried through until another birth. And as you said, it can really cause problems going into another birth experience if it hasn't been properly processed. And you mentioned childhood, and I would say that is generally a classic example of where so much trauma happens that doesn't get processed because children often don't have a context and they don't
Mhm.
have a language for what's going on. And if they're in a safe environment where they have loving, empathetic parents, that makes a difference. But if a child perceives that there isn't safety or isn't understanding, they're going to carry whatever traumatic event happened inside their memory and their body, and it will wreak havoc in their life sometime down the road.
And possibly, I mean, I work with children now in my job where they are a lot of these children are holding trauma, and it is coming through, in the life right now through behavioral issues, through, there's a myriad of other issues like self-care issues. And one of the things I hear sometimes in my profession, we're like, that's not actually, is we hear, oh, children are resilient. They can bounce back from anything, or it went over their head. They didn't really understand it anyway. And I can see the evidence in some of the children I work with where they may not have understood what happened, but it affected them in a way where it is now manifesting in all these other ways that we are now having to deal with. We're having to process it with them. And so, yeah, that is very interesting about the childhood trauma and the language. I think that's an important thing to think about is, yes, they aren't equipped with the language. And so maybe it won't be until much later on in their lives that when they do have
Right.
the language, they start to say, "Oh, wait, hang on.
Right.
I
Or
wasn't
there's no context. If something happens, let's say a child is sexually abused and they don't even have an understanding of what sex is or
right,
what the genitals are for other than using the bathroom. That
right."
could be such a shocking experience. There's no context. So, in addition to no language, there's no framework for what's going on. And that can really cause some devastation.
So,
And you're right in that a lot of people say children are resilient. Well, yes and no. Children are masters of coping, and
mm,
we all cope in different ways. And again, as children, we don't necessarily understand what the best coping mechanisms are. So a child will beg, steal, and borrow whatever happens to work in the situation, whether it's consciously or especially unconsciously.
yeah, yeah. So when we're talking about trauma and grieving trauma, you have been kind of processing this for a while, and that's why we have you
Yes.
on the podcast today, is to talk about what it looks like to kind of process this trauma, grieving through trauma. And so I just wondered if you had like a story or something to kind of help us get started on the process that you've been walking through.
Yes, I'd be happy to share that. Um, so, as a very young adult, I began to realize that I had been abused as a child. And I'm not going to name specifics, nor am I going to name people, but I had a childhood full of abuse.
Mm,
And that was the word and the definition that I used. And I carried that for many, many years. And in 2019, I remember an experience that was very unusual for me. Let me back up and say that I've had a lot of medical issues in my life, both as a child and as an adult. As a child, I suffered with severe allergies and asthma and eczema, and none of that has actually ever gone away. I have seasons of reprieve from that, but it flares up, it comes and goes. And then as an adult, I began to experience episodes of chronic fatigue. And in the last 5 to 7 years, I've begun to experience symptoms of fibromyalgia as well. And again, I have times when things tend to flare up worse and times when the pain eases out a little bit. But I began to seek help from a holistic practitioner. And as I would go to visit her, she started me on a different rotation of vitamins and medications and supplements. So at first we were trying iron. Oh, you're tired all of the time. You need iron. And then let's try ashwagandha. Let's try a vitamin B complex. Oh, you probably need some vitamin D. Why don't we try magnesium before you go to bed? And every time I would see her, it was a different thing that was being presented to me as a possibility. And
yeah.
we were also working on balancing hormones. And at one point, I remember coming home very frustrated, and I said to my husband, I just don't know what's going to work. And he was also frustrated and said, "You seem to be the only person that modern medicine cannot help." And I think we just both had hit a major level of frustration at that point, and we
Wow.
had no answers. So in 2019, I went to see an ophthalmologist because my vision was getting worse, and I knew I needed glasses, but I was dreading going because I had a problem wearing sunglasses. So I kept 3 to 4 pairs of sunglasses in my car for when I needed long distance driving because I couldn't wear more than one pair per hour before needing to switch. And I would need to give my face a break from the sunglasses because there was just so much discomfort in
Hmm.
wearing anything on my face.
Yeah. Okay.
And I had the same problem with hair barrettes or headbands or hats or heavy earrings or necklaces, anything having to do with my face and head, even heavy neck scarves. And all of those things would end up giving me a massive headache, even after just an hour or two
Yeah.
of wearing them. So, also in my car, I would have to make sure that I put a clip on my seatbelt because just the pressure of the seatbelt constantly against my shoulder,
Yes.
even though it was so small, would be enough to give me a headache. So I'm visiting this ophthalmologist who says I need glasses, obviously. And I told him I'm very concerned that I'm not going to be able to wear glasses. And he's inviting me to try out contacts. And I said, I have terrible allergies. My eyes stay aggravated. But I began to explain to him everything that I just shared with you.
Yeah.
And it was the strangest thing. He pulled up very close to me and got in my face. And he looked deeply into my eyes and he said, "That's psychosomatic. And you have endured some serious trauma in your life. And I don't know what it is, but I am so sorry that you have had such a level of trauma to invade your life." I was floored, Dawn. I didn't know what in the world to say. Of course, I had been through terrible situations as an adult, but I had gone to counseling for that. And those were just events in my life.
Hmm.
So, as this doctor shared his idea with me, I held it together until I left his office. And then I got in the car, and 3 of my daughters were with me, and I just sat behind the steering wheel, and I lost it. I started sobbing, and I even started beating the steering wheel, and my daughters are looking at me like, "What in the world?" This was not normal behavior for me, okay? And I drove home, and I was so angry. I said,
Yeah.
"Lord, I have worked on all of this stuff, and now I'm finding out that my body is falling apart because of some trauma. What even is this?" And it
Hmm.
was a brand new idea to me.
Hmm.
So fast forward from there, and we had the pandemic. So I just really enjoyed a break from life for a while. And I know that was a terrible time for everyone.
Yeah.
But for me, it ended up being a great blessing because I had time off from a lot of different
Yes.
responsibilities.
Yep.
And through that process of coming out of the pandemic as the world began to open back up, I was invited by my church to help facilitate a small group for our recovery program.
Mm.
And as I began to work through that, one of my friends in the program who was a leader sent me a podcast. And the podcast episode was from The Place We Find Ourselves, hosted by Adam Young. And as I began to listen to this podcast, once again, I was floored. He talks a lot about trauma
Mm.
and the meeting of psychology and theology. And all of this was brand new material for me. And I began to realize that I was carrying trauma in my body.
Yes.
And of course, I read the very famous book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And the more I read, the more things resonated with me that I was just carrying all kinds of trauma in my body. And I wasn't sure how much of my symptoms were related to that versus just something hereditary.
Yeah.
I
Right.
had no idea. But what I did do was take a sabbatical. And I remember talking with you about that in the early days. I told our church leaders that I was taking time off from leading anything, which I was on the worship team for both English and Spanish services and leading a small group for our recovery ministry and then being asked to step into a slightly larger role of coaching and then campus lead, and many other things that I was involved in at the time. And it was just becoming overwhelming.
Yeah, I can
But I
imagine.
really felt like the Lord was just calling me to rest and to heal. So we had a night of prayer at our church, and I went to our campus pastor and I asked him to anoint me with oil and pray for my healing. And I do believe that was a serious moment when God began to really reveal to me how much this trauma had impacted my life. So now I've spent the last 2 years working through what has this trauma done to me,
Mm,
and how do I begin the healing journey from it? How do I understand more deeply how it's impacted me, how it's impacted my family? It's been rigorous, it's been extremely painful, it's been murky. It's not a linear process by any stretch.
right.
And I have been riddled with grief.
So when we think about grief, you think of, I've lost my mom, I lost my nana, I lost, my child, and I am sad. So I think about that person, and I feel sad like this. I might feel guilt, I might feel anger, I might feel intense sadness when I'm triggered by thinking about that person, or I'm reminded of that person or event. So what does grieving trauma versus grieving the loss of a person, how might that be different or the same? What does that look like?
Okay, that's a great question, Dawn. For me, I began to recognize that there were so many losses from the trauma.
Mm,
So I didn't lose a person necessarily, but then again, I lost myself.
yeah.
I lost the true nature of who I really am as a human and as a daughter of the king.
Mhm.
I didn't have a proper way forward. I
Yeah.
didn't have an understanding of all the things that had happened to me and how they impacted me. And I began to grieve bad choices that I had made because I was set up for those choices by my trauma.
Yes.
I'm not excusing sin,
Right.
understand,
Yeah.
but I was led to many of those choices. One of those bad choices was stepping into a fundamentalist cult.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
just all of the damage that that created for myself and then for my children. And now we've all spent years of trying to recover from that. Some of us are doing better than others. But that was such a loss for me to realize that I stepped into something that was so hard and ugly and costly.
Yes. Yeah.
So, grieving all of the losses from that, and then the loss of community from that, because once I moved away from that, that was a great loss as well. Anyone who understands anything about cults realizes that community is actually one of the magnets,
Yes.
one of the pieces of glue that holds the thing together. It's not the only one, but it's a large one. And so the fear of a loss of community drives the decision to stay often. And so the loss of community, the loss of safety
Mm,
for myself, both as a child and as an adult, the loss of safety for my children, and the loss of my health. I mean, good grief.
yeah.
I'm finally now 50 years old this year, and only the last 2 years really beginning to understand what has happened to my body. And there's so much grief wrapped up in the fact that I may never fully heal from this. It has really taken a toll. And all the steps that I'm taking are hopefully improving things, but it may not be enough.
Right.
So that and then the anger, you mentioned the anger. My goodness, Dawn, I have wrestled with that. I've been angry at God at times. I've been angry at my church at times. It's hard to reconcile discovering all those levels of pain and just now being able to deal with it and then wondering. I think one of my hardest questions I've asked the Lord is, why didn't you allow me to learn this sooner? Why didn't
Mm,
you bring this information to me before now? And then the
mhm.
same question to my church. Why didn't you help me discover this? Why didn't you put me on a path of discovery? And the same with my healthcare practitioner. Why didn't you offer trauma up as a first option? And I had to bring that to her attention rather than her bringing it to mine. So there's anger wrapped up in that. And of course, I can't legitimately be angry for people who didn't know, who had no idea, but I felt like I had to put that anger somewhere. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yes.
And so there's also such a large bundle of sadness that goes with all of that. I have grieved for the little girl that I was and all that she had to face.
Mhm.
And that's been part of my healing process is going back and learning how to reparent that little girl and to say to her when she's in those broken moments, "Hey, you're not alone.
Yeah.
Christ is with you. I'm with you.
Mhm.
And I see where you're going and I want you to feel seen and heard." And I think
Yeah.
that's the damage from trauma is that we don't feel seen and heard. It
Absolutely.
is that absence of the presence of someone empathetic.
Yeah.
And so realizing just how lonely I
Mm.
have been through the majority of my life has been incredibly, incredibly sad.
Yeah. And you mentioned like I had remembered something. So when you are, I had a childhood probably a little similar to yours, where there was abuse, and you're sitting, and I maybe you've experienced this too. As an adult, I'm sitting here and I'm remembering, as I'm processing grief, I'm processing trauma, the trauma from my life, and I'm grieving these things as well. And you remember people who were part of your lives, and you say, "Why didn't you rescue me? Why didn't you do this, this, and this? Why didn't you come into the house when these things were happening and pull us out or save us or do something?" And then finding out later on, I found out that some people who I was angry with had no idea.
Right,
The people who were in charge of my life at the time were so good at covering the trauma and the abuse that outsiders had no idea, and they didn't know how to rescue me, even though my little girl inside is saying, "I could have been spared this. I could have been spared this trauma in my adulthood. I could have been spared my health issues as an adult if someone there had rescued me." But where do you put that anger when you find out they didn't know? They had no
right,
idea. So they couldn't have done it even if they had wanted to, but because they didn't know. So there is that level of anger that I
right.
think
And I
is
think for
very
me,
real.
that's where I turned around and put it all right back on God.
Mhm. Yes.
You did know and you allowed this to happen. So, what do I do with that? So, we've been in some wrestling matches together, and I think I mentioned this on the previous podcast, but sometimes the idea that God is in control is not super comforting to me because if he's in control, he could change the outcome or he could change the circumstance and the situation. Now, of course, he's in control. I know that. But what I'm saying is that is not what brings me comfort. It is the idea that Christ is with me and he's always been with me. And even as a little girl, I put my faith in him very specifically at age 7. Of
Mm.
course, I knew his name and knew who he was, but I had not invited him into a relationship with myself, or I didn't have an awareness of his invitation to me, I guess would be more accurate. But at 7, we joined together and it changed my life. But that didn't eradicate any of the trauma that was going on in my life at the time, but I felt his presence with me all throughout childhood. And he did give me ways to cope. We talked earlier about children finding ways, and some of mine were healthy and some not so healthy. I absolutely became a bookworm. So, books were one of the tools that God used to save my life.
Yeah.
And we lived next to the woods. So, I spent a great deal of time out in nature. And that was very resetting for me when I got dysregulated. And I also learned to crochet as a small child. So just the rhythmic nature of sitting and using a hook and yarn over and over was extremely regulating for me. And then music. I took piano lessons starting at age 5. And so many times when I didn't have words, I could pour feelings out through the keys. And then I think the final piece was my grandmother. I had a grandma who was not expressive, not affectionate, but she was safe and I knew that she loved me. So she was a place that I could go and just be myself and not worry about anything else that was happening in my life for those brief hours. But
Mm.
those were my coping mechanisms. I guess most of those were healthy.
Mm.
The other that probably was unhealthy is that Dawn, I really did want to be seen and heard.
Mm.
So I became a different person at school.
Yeah.
I was often the class clown, and I wasn't afraid of getting into trouble, and I absolutely was not afraid of challenging authority. So I know that surprises you probably. Um, but I would do anything to get a laugh from my classmates. And the thing is, I'm not naturally all that funny. I'm not witty, but I would just do ridiculous things, things out of the ordinary. I wasn't afraid of being weird or different. So, those were maybe my unhealthy coping mechanisms where I was always seeking attention, but it was a cry. It was, now I can look at it and see it for what it was, and I can celebrate that little girl who was just longing to be seen and heard. I mean, what a God given desire that is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But I have been made to feel ashamed of that for most of my adult life until I really
Yeah.
started doing this work of healing.
Yeah.
But also, I think the grieving process has helped me to be able to honestly explore these areas and to welcome the darker pieces of me, if you will.
Okay. I want to get to the darker pieces of you. I want to circle back to that, but I did want to kind of touch base on the moments in your childhood when God was with you. I'm going to share something from my childhood, and maybe something similar happened in yours. Just little moments when we can say we look back. And that's the whole point of this podcast, is being able to look back and say, there was God. That's when God was there with me.
Mm-hmm.
I, of course, I had a traumatic childhood. I, at the time, a lot of my childhood didn't know it was traumatic until I was older. And then I'm out and among other kids going, oh, wait, that's not normal. Like,
Right.
I thought that was normal. But there was sadness. I mean, I was sad. I was always called over dramatic. You and I have a lot in common. I'm musical. I like to read. I like to write. I love to be outside, and I crochet. So, like, all these things are coping mechanisms, things that settled me, whatever. And one of the things was reading, and I had an aunt. I mean, I still love her to death now. Multiple times throughout my life, she's a point in my story where God has shown up to me through her. And one in particular was when I was, and this is amazing. I told my husband this and he went, "What? You were 8?" When I was 8 years old, she gave me a book called Hind's Feet on High Places
Oh, one of
by
my
Hannah
all-time
Pomare.
favorites. Mm.
And she gave me Mountain of Spices, and I think Mountain of Spices is my favorite. And at 8 years old, I devoured both of those books. And I remember being 8 years old saying, God is with me.
Mm.
Like, this is God. He was with Much Afraid. I'm like Much Afraid. And these are all the ways that he met her and ministered to her and was with her. And it just stuck with me for the rest of my life. But that was like a moment I look back on and say, wow, that was God saying, I'm walking with you through this. And at that time, at 8 years old, I didn't really have a concept of what was happening to me, until later. So I'm sure you have, if you have any moments like that, you can,
I
if you
have
can
a
relate.
very similar story. I didn't have a book given to me by anyone in particular, but I found the book The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom
Yes.
on the shelves at my house, and I think I was 12.
Mm.
I know I was 12 when I discovered this book. And I read it cover to cover in such a quick amount of time. And then I turned around and read it again because that was the first place I ever encountered real Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And I was raised in a very spiritual community, religious community. I went to church. My family went to church, but it was a backwoods, nominal Christianity, I would say. It was a Sunday morning Christianity. Now, the people I was around were wholesome, they were good hearted people, but nobody talked about their faith and nobody lived out the hard spaces of life audibly. Okay.
Yeah.
So when I read The Hiding Place, it changed my life. And I began to see, oh my goodness, Corey and her sister Betsy went through such horrendous things. And God was with her. And she tells very specific stories of how God met their needs being in a concentration camp at Ravensbrück. And as she told those stories, I realized, wow, I mean, God kept her through all of this. And obviously, she made it through to the other side to write the story. And she had such a wonderful testimony of how God had worked in her life during these dark days. So every year after age 12, I reread the book. And then I read it again to my children out loud 2 or 3 times. And I still revisit the book every 2 or 3 years. I have multiple copies of it in different formats. But that book showed me exactly what you said, that God was with me. If he could be with Corey in those hard places, he could be with me in my hard places. And my
Yeah.
hard places didn't feel nearly as hard as hers.
Right. Oh, yeah. When you put it in perspective of something like the Holocaust, you're like, okay, all right. So going back to, I think, what was it that you said? Something about the dark places of you. What was that about the dark places?
Right. I think I've learned a little bit the last year about, I don't remember where I heard the term, but it was our shadow side.
Mm,
And so often in Christianity, we want to cover up the sinful pieces, the dark pieces, the unflattering pieces of our personality. And that was me to a T. I'm an Enneagram 7.
mm.
So I avoid pain like the plague, but
Yeah.
especially the pain of revealing who I really am.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
So part of my healing process in the grief has been to actually name those pieces of myself that I didn't necessarily like or love, and realizing that these are the parts Christ came to redeem.
Yeah.
And when those parts are surrendered to Him, and especially when they're engaged with curiosity rather than condemnation,
Yes.
that's where the
That's
real healing
good.
starts.
Yeah.
And I can even say that was another piece of my grief, because I had not known until this time, until I entered this current healing journey, that I should engage these parts of myself with curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I engaged everything with condemnation,
Yeah.
hide it, stuff it away. Even when I would confess something that was going on, it still was a confession with condemnation. And as I began to ask the questions, wait a second, why are you feeling this way? Why
Mm-hmm.
are you behaving this way? And instead of feeling guilt or shame immediately, trying to feel curiosity first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then learning that that curiosity is a gift of a path back in the past to where all of this started.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, one of my big struggles has been with food, that I used food as another unhealthy coping mechanism as a child. But it was hard for me to admit that for a long, long time. And when I now end up with a food struggle, which is far less than it used to be, rather than being angry at myself or punishing myself, or I need to quick just go run and tell on myself.
Yeah.
I mean, that's good, that I should tell on myself probably, but only after I've done the hard work of digging down and saying, okay, what's going on right now that's creating this anxiety, this stress? Why do you feel like food is going to fix it? But asking those questions in kindness, not with
Yes.
condemnation,
Yes.
right?
So as we process trauma and grief is coming up, and we've talked about anger, guilt, shame, condemnation, all of those things, which when I was grieving multiple times in my life, grieving Ezekiel, grieving the death of my mother, grieving my childhood as well, that guilt, that shame, that anger, that condemnation, I'm throwing back on God, right? Because
Mm,
that question does come up, which is, you're supposed to be in control. How did
mhm.
this happen to me? And we have the answers, like we live in a broken world, and we know, which again, those answers might be truth. They just aren't comforting or helpful all the time.
Right.
So, how, when you were grieving your trauma, how did all of that affect your walk with God? So, for instance, did you go through the anger and then did that shift? Or did you come to Him, with, like you said, curiosity, and then it shifted to anger? Like, I guess, what was that walking with God as we are experiencing all this with Him? He is with us. We've already
Right.
affirmed that He was with you and I in all of these struggles and these times in our childhood. So now that we're processing this childhood and this trauma, how does that affect our walk with God?
Mm, yeah. Um, Again, for me, it's not been so cut and dried. I have had moments of anger at God and then turn around and the next day feel his peace
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and feel the joy of the Lord and feel a measure of health and wholeness being restored,
Mm-hmm.
only to find a week later I'm sinking back into the sadness or the anger.
Yeah.
And I think I was afraid to enter this process in the first place because it always feels like a dark hole you're never going to be able to climb out of.
Yeah.
And just recognizing that, as again, Corey Ten Boom's sister Betsy said, or maybe it was Corey that said, there's no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. So I
Yes.
had to hold on to that, thinking of however far I descend in this grief, once again, he's there with me.
Mm-hmm.
But that means that I can turn around and be angry with him.
Yeah.
All healthy relationships dance in and out of joy and anger, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have that with my husband. I have that with my children. It's not all roses and sunshine all the time, but we have to have that safety to be able to enter into that anger. David is a great illustration of that in the Psalms. He pours
Yeah.
out his heart in multiple ways to God. Sometimes he's accusing God,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes he's questioning God. And I begin to learn that it's okay for me to do all of those things as well. God isn't going anywhere.
Right. That's
And
right.
my questions don't scare him, and my anger doesn't anger him in return. He's very patient.
Mm-hmm.
And on my good days, I recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
At this point in my journey, I probably have more good days than bad days, but I still have bad days. And I'm learning not to, um, the same condemnation that I've had for myself, I'm learning to work through that when I have a day where my faith is waning or where my questions to God are just poured out in anger or frustration. And rather than feeling guilty, oh, you shouldn't ever think these things about God, I'm realizing that it's important for me to be honest
Yeah.
in order to enter the healing. I believe that's what brings him honor and glory.
Mm-hmm.
It's not our fake attitudes, it's not our exterior, but it's when we're able to be fully honest with him, because what that shows is that we truly trust him,
Yes. And that brings
right?
me to the question I was going to ask was a lot of people that I have come across in my life have said, "Oh no, you just need to be grateful. You just need to be thankful.
Mm,
You need to give praise and honor to God. Yes, I know you went through something hard, but let's not dwell on how hard it was or how mad you are at God. You need to just be thankful, for the life he's given you and just be grateful and reflect that back to God." In your experience, is that healthy, helpful, damaging? Like,
it's not healthy nor helpful, nor is it authentic or honest. Um, and it's spiritual bypassing is what it is.
yeah, okay. Can explain go deeper into what do you mean by the spiritual bypassing?
We're bypassing the process that God has us in.
Mhm. Mhm.
We're bypassing the journey that he's laid before us. And what if his journey is for us to grieve and to wrestle?
Yes.
He wrestled with Jacob.
Yes.
And one of the biggest comforts I've had in this process is I realized in reading a book by Dan Allender, he pointed this out, that in Jacob's wrestling with God, God started it,
Yes, yeah.
right?
Yeah, and it
Because
is important, yeah.
God wanted to blow up Jacob's paradigm of who he was. So I have found a lot of comfort in that even as I've poured out doubt and frustration and anger at God, I realize he's blowing up my boxes and wanting to expand my understanding of who he is and expand my depth of relationship with him. And there's a wonderful tool called the U diagram. I believe it was introduced by Kathy Lorzell, who was with the Allender Center. But the idea is that if we look at the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, so often we want to skip from Friday to Sunday.
Yes, yes.
And so there's this you where we have to go down into the depths of Saturday and we have to dwell there. We have to reside in the darkness and the danger and the grunge and the gross
And the grief.
and and the grief. I mean, I've thought about that so much now in my grief process. What were the disciples feeling on Saturday? What were all of Jesus' followers feeling on Saturday? What was his family feeling?
Mhm.
I mean, in their estimation, he had failed at every promise he had made,
Right.
right?
Right.
They didn't have perspective in that moment. They probably were angry, disappointed, frustrated, scared for sure,
Mhm, mhm.
but they had to live with all of those feelings.
Yes, yes.
And then on Sunday comes the resurrection, but you have to do your time.
Mhm.
You have to spend time in Saturday. And when I read that concept that Kathy Lorzell introduced, it made such a difference for me. It rang true in the very depths of my soul. All of our grieving processes look so differently. Sometimes the timeline can be short. Sometimes it can be extraordinarily long. And what absolutely is true is that it can't be shortchanged if we
Yeah.
expect to have healing in the end.
I agree. And with the disciples, some people would look at that and say, well, if they had just believed Jesus and what he said, they wouldn't have been grieving. They wouldn't have been sad or scared. Well, I would love to put myself into that situation and say, I think I would have a really hard time believing everything Jesus said. It was contrary to the culture where I would be growing up in. And so it's logical for the disciples to not quite grasp everything he was saying and to be thrown, like you said, into that you part, and in that grief and that sadness and that they're scared and they're frustrated and they're lost and all of those feelings, and that's not bad, and they were not sinning because they didn't just were
Right.
happy and saying, well, he said he's coming back, so he's coming back. Like, they weren't sinning because they didn't fully believe or understand that at the time. And Jesus even said he grieved for the fact that they were incapable of understanding it at that time, but he was still preaching it and saying it and comforting them, so that when he came back, all those things came back and they were like, oh, I remember. He said that. Oh, yes, that's right. He did say that. And he did say this is what was going to happen. And so I think it is important for us to understand that it is okay to be honest with what we're feeling. It is
Yes. Well,
not a
God
sin.
God gave us a full range of emotions. He
Yeah.
created us that way. And we have this dirty little habit of saying some of these emotions are negative or
Yes.
bad. No, the emotions tell us what's going on deep down inside. Our emotions are a gift.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we always have to follow them or capitalize on them,
Or act.
but pay attention to them. By all means, pay attention. They're telling us a story, and they are a gift from our Heavenly Father who made us in his image. And if we look through scripture, we find him expressing so many emotions. He expresses frustration and anger and sadness
Yes.
and longing
And
and
loss.
so many things. So if he made us in his image, why on earth would it be sinful for us to feel those things? And why would it be sinful for us to doubt? If we don't have doubt, we can't have faith, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is doubting and then believing anyway, trusting anyway.
Jesus did not cast Thomas out of his presence because Thomas was doubting. He
Right.
actually invited Thomas to get closer to him and
Hmm.
and touch him and do the things that the other disciples were scared to do. He was like, "Come on, Thomas, come. You're doubting me, so let's get face to face." And so I think that's important. And so what do you I know you have a little bit of a story with doubt. So do you have anything to add to maybe grief and trauma and doubting and all this process with your journey?
Well, I would say that entering into the grief caused me to question everything I've ever known,
Mm,
including my relationship with God, scripture, my relationship with the church.
yeah.
I began to realize that I've been taught a certain set of things and I've taken them at face value. And once I began healing, that actually created space within me to have more courage to ask the hard questions. They've always been there. The
Mhm.
hard questions have
Mhm.
always been there,
Yeah.
but I didn't feel safe to ask them until some of the healing began to take place in my life. And realizing that it did stir some doubt. Again, back to the question, God, if you were really good or if you really loved me, why would you allow this to happen? Relying on God to help me reframe that. And again, entering childhood trauma and asking Jesus, where were you when this was taking
Yeah.
place? And literally having a vision of Jesus sitting on my bed in the
Mm,
bedroom while there's something terrible happening to me,
yeah.
or Jesus in the car with me, or different things like that. But him opening my eyes to realize I was never alone, he was always there. So his presence was worth so much more to me than anything else. And he knows that I'm going to have days of doubting. I mean, I'm certainly no better than the disciples. As you expressed, I can't imagine being there and not feeling those exact same feelings of doubt and fear and frustration and incredulity.
Yeah.
Like I've been duped.
Yeah.
What in the world?
Right.
And I think I have felt that in this journey. God has brought that back to the surface. Sometimes I feel like I've been duped. How could you bring me into this place, or how could you allow these things to happen? And then I have to go back and rely on my positive experiences of God and his presence. That's the only thing that has kept me afloat. When I have the doubts surface, rather than pushing them away or squelching them, I have to match that doubt with the reality of a time that Christ was near, or a time when he came through for me, or a time when he showed his presence very real in my life. It's a little bit like stacking the stones by the River Jordan. I have to have a memorial to go back and visit and to remember his goodness, because there are really dark days when it feels like he's not good. It feels like he's distant, or it feels like he just doesn't care.
And
But
yeah, it
I know those things are not true because he's
exactly.
proven it over and over again in my life.
Exactly. And I think the idea of having memorials, whether it is a journal that you're keeping, whether it is a plaque you put somewhere, or like for us, of course I have a journal, but I have literal stones where we
Mm.
wrote scripture verses on
Hinds
them.
feet on high places, right?
Yes, so we said this is a memorial of what God has done for us, so we remember, because there are dark days. There are days when you do it is important to understand you might feel like God is distant. He has abandoned you. I've have had that feeling too. He's abandoned me. He didn't care about me. He cared more about someone else than he did about me. He didn't heal my mother. He didn't heal my son. So those dark days, it is important to remember those are my feelings. That's not the reality. The reality was that he was always there, and it is those memorials that I can go back to and say, yeah, he proved himself to me in this situation. He had an aunt give me a book. He had someone else come into my life and speak a word of something encouraging. He had people rally around me and pray over me during times I didn't even know I needed it. And so I think it is important for us to write those things down and remember the
And
reality of
I
it. He's there.
I hear people saying, well, the cross of Christ should be enough. That
Mm,
should be enough for, any doubt that might arise. And look what he did, and look at his incredible sacrifice.
mhm.
And to all of that, I say yes. But also, we are human.
Yes.
And he knows our frailty. He knows our struggles. And he is a compassionate friend and brother. And he doesn't condemn us,
Yes.
right? So he understands those places that we enter, and it's okay.
And I'm gonna mention Job again because I'm still reading Job again, and I love it. But I was reminded, I was talking to someone the other day, and she reminded me that it wasn't Satan who came to God and said, "Look at your servant Job." It was God
Right.
who said, "Do you see my
Have you
servant Job?"
considered Right, have you considered my servant
He
Job?
started it. God
Mhm.
started the process. And when you
Which
look at
doesn't sound very kind or good, does it? No.
but when you see the process, and if and I don't know, but if all of this, if grief and trauma, if he is using the evil of the world to, I don't quite know how to word this the correct way, but when you look at Job and you see that this process started and Job was one way, and Job questioned God, he was angry with God, the way he spoke in the beginning of the book versus what he said at the end, where
Mm,
he says, I am speaking of things I do not understand. And he said, and I know that when my skin is dead, I will see God face to face. He
mm,
had this faith, this unshakable trust in God
mm.
that wasn't there in the beginning. And you just see this shift and this change. If it was on purpose or if it was just used, like, I just look
Right.
at that and say, that is something amazing that God can produce out of this that we're going through.
And I have come back to that exact phrase multiple times. God, this is more than I can understand. I have way more questions than I have answers. And right now, that's okay. I may not ever have answers, but I have to trust that there's something out there beyond me that you're doing. And that's where the trust comes in, that none of this makes sense to me right now, but you're still God.
Yeah.
And I have to believe that you're working all of these things for my good,
Yeah.
even when it doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do love and we're going to close in a minute, but I do love the picture. And you mentioned this in the beginning that every relationship has these moments where you're angry, you're frustrated. And I have often said, if I can't come to God like I would come to my husband and say, you hurt me.
Hmm.
Like, what that hurt me. I need to understand this. And even if I can't fully understand it, being able to have that safety to come before God, say, this is how I'm feeling, whether or not what I'm feeling is valid, I need to be able to express it and then wait and invite God to speak into my life and to guide me and shape me. But I think the waiting is important. Like if I come to my husband and I just rail against him and leave the room, there's no healing there. There's no restoration. But if I come and I say, let's have a conversation, let's heal this relationship so that we can be stronger and move forward. I think it is important for us to understand that as we are going through grief, as we're processing trauma, that we need to be able to wait for God to speak.
Right. If we don't come to him with all of those things, and if we don't wait on the process, we don't give God an opportunity to clarify,
Mhm.
and we don't give him an opportunity to comfort.
Yep.
And he knows which one of those we need most in the moment, because we're really good at asking the questions, why? Why is this happening to me? Why are you allowing this? And he may actually answer that in time,
Mhm.
but he may not. He may say, what you need more than answers is my presence.
Yes.
But we get to leave that up to him, and it really is part of his beautiful process, that dance we do in and out of life and death,
Yeah.
and just knowing that he's covering all.
Well, Yolanda, thank you so much. I'm sure we can find a myriad of other things to talk about and dive into and
Mhm.
just be here for hours and hours. But I'm so glad that you were vulnerable enough to share your story with us and to be open and honest about what God is doing in your life and that it is a process that is not over, that you're still processing and that that's okay. So thank you so much for joining us today and
Oh,
sharing.
thank you for having me, Dawn. I've really enjoyed being here.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Grieving with God podcast. I hope to see you again next week as we continue to explore what it looks like to grieve with God. Does God show up for us? In what ways does He show us that He is here for us in our sorrow? And how can we honor Him as we walk through the tough times in our lives? Hope to see you again next week.